Yes, the project seems to be very interesting and very technology intensive and capital intensive project. Okay, now we finished the first round of the presentation by the 5 speakers, and before I open the floor, we may have discussions among the panelists, especially if you have any questions on the other speakers, please feel free to ask any questions. Please.
Right, I have a question to Hugh Whitaker. So this increasing multiculturalization of New Zealand, what does it mean for the original bicultural identity of the country? Oh yeah, okay.
Okay, by bicultural you mean white, Pākehā and Māori.
That's right.
Bicultural relations. Well, I think for Māori people this is a kind of complex story because there was a treaty that was signed in 1840 between representatives of the British Crown and Maori chiefs, and there was numerous problems with the implementation of that treaty, and a lot of grievances have come before the courts. And so there's a kind of a bicultural a discussion between Māori and the New Zealand government over grievances. And now all of a sudden New Zealand has become multicultural, so the cultural situation is much more complex. So for Māori people, I think this is a complicated thing. On the one hand, they welcome the fact that the white majority is becoming diluted, and New Zealand is forced to become multicultural. On the other hand, they've kind of losing their place in the other discussion, the privileged place that they had in that. So it's a very complicated story. But it's also interesting that as a result of these grievances, a lot of land has been returned to Māori tribes, and they have economic resources now that they didn't have before, and they know that their future is around engaging with Asia and trading with Asia and developing links with Asia. So my institute, we co-located with a Centre for Māori and Pacific Economic Development. We've co-located together because we see it useful to have a dialogue around Māori and Asia as well, and I think that's really important for New Zealand because the Māori economy is becoming a significant economy in New Zealand once again. So it's a rather complex story, but in what it means for our institute is we cooperate with Māori and Pacific with a sister institute. We've co-located together, we have conferences together and so on, because we want to engage with Asia together.
Any other question? We'll open the floor. So, I ask a question to the Professor Nasrudin, because you didn't have enough time to explain this Asiatic Institute. Because this Asiatic Institute seems to be very interesting. It has several research centers, but also it has some international master degree program. So can you elaborate a little bit how many staffs you have, and then who are the students, especially the students only from the Malaysia, or because this is the Asia-Europe program, you attract European students to this program.
Okay, thank you very much. As I mentioned just now, in 1996, Dr. Mahathir proposed to the SM leaders in Bangkok in order to enhance relations between Asia and Europe in higher education. Malaysia will establish Asia-Europe University. And we started as a center, Asia-Europe Center, in 1997, and then upgraded into Asia-Europe Institute in the year 2000. Currently, we have 4 teaching staff in our institute, but we rely more on visiting professors. And we have currently 26 visiting professors from Asia and Europe teaching in our institute. And we have masters and PhD students only. We don't have undergraduates. In terms of academic program, we have 4 international master's programs: small and medium enterprises, regional integration, information management, and ASEAN studies. We provide a scholarship to international and local students. Our target is 60 international students and 40 local students. And for the scholarship, we have 40 altogether. And we encourage students from Europe as well as Asia to come to the Asia-Europe Institute. And we already proposed new programs to the Ministry of Education, International Masters in EU Studies. So when we get approval from the Ministry, we will open this new program. And for the internship, I mentioned just now, all students must go for the internship for 2 months. And we also provide the airfare as well as the housing allowance and stipend. And normally they will go to the ASEAN Secretariat, APEC Secretariat, United Nations in Geneva, and then embassies, as well as multinational corporations. Yeah. So we hope to get students from Asia and Europe. Currently, the majority are from China. We have 5 altogether. Yeah, for this academic session. Yeah, we also have students from Germany, from Poland, from Czech Republic, previously from Mexico, and every year we have students from Southeast Asia like Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, yeah, including Myanmar as well. So thank you.
Just maybe ask another question to the Professor Kölner. You mentioned that there was some decline in the general interest and funding for area studies, especially in Asia, after Asian financial crisis. That point was also raised by Professor Whitaker. Then you mentioned again, I mean, since late 2000s, there were revival of interest, especially the funding from the German government. So my first question is the address of the funding. Is that enough to stimulate people's research on this Asia? So I'm not really sure if the people really lost interest in that area. Maybe not enough to stimulate their interest just by the funding. So is there any problems? And then you didn't mention anything about the collaboration between the GIGA or University of Hamburg with and any other Asian institutions. So if you have any flagship collaboration project, can you illustrate that?
Right. Well, I think sort of the changing perceptions of China in the wake of the so-called Asian financial and economic crisis, I think it only played a certain role. I think it was more of a secondary factor. Other things were more important when it came to this sort of crisis, if you want to call it that way, of area studies and Asian studies. I think what was more important was on the one hand the need to cut costs, and it was much easier sort of to cut costs at small centers, because many of these sort of Asian study centers in Germany sort of revolved around 1 or 2 chairs, and so there, when that person or these 2 persons sort of maybe retire, there's less resistance than trying to cut a few professorships, let's say, in the Department of Law or Business Administration. It would be an uproar, but it's much easier now to close down this small center. So it was just sort of convenient in many ways, because there was no coordination among the different regional units. Sort of these small centers were easier to hit in some ways. Also with respect to, let's say, performance requirements, smaller subjects in Asian studies, they were in a more difficult situation because fewer number of graduate students in general than the big subjects. So I think sort of perceptions only played a sort of really sort of secondary role in there. Their interest in Asia has remained strong overall, but sometimes the foci have changed. I remember when I became sort of interested and then later on involved in, let's say, Japanese studies, there was quite a bit of interest in the early 1990s, for example, in Japanese economy, Japanese politics. When you these days look at Japanese studies in Germany, so the overall number of students has really remained the same. Enrollment numbers are high, but these days students would be more interested in Japanese popular culture, right? They're more interested in anime and manga. So interest has certainly remained high, but there have been sort of shifts in foci, what people are really interested in. Actually, as a matter of fact, for an institute like GIGA, that's problematic because we want to hire people, sort of, virgin scholars on Japanese politics and society. What do we get? We get, lots of sort of young scholars working on anime and manga, which is not useful for an institute like ours, at least. International collaborations. When GIGA set up its own doctoral program a couple of years ago, we were in need of engaging in more sort of institutional collaboration with Asian partners and more broadly. So before we weren't really interested in signing institutional cooperation agreements because we felt that most of the time they were not really worth the paper they were written on, because cooperation revolves around people and shared interests rather than sort of just cooperation agreements signed between institutions. However, since we set up this doctoral program, there has been increased need to send out doctoral students to universities and think tanks around the globe. So I think we signed loads of cooperation agreements with respect to Asia, around 7 or so, with partners in basically China, India, Taiwan, and a couple in Europe as well. But having said that, we have a few, let's say, core institutional partners where we have plenty of staff exchanges, where we organize conferences on a regular basis. And these would include in the Republic, this would include in China Foreign Affairs University, for one. In India, it would be the Institute of Defense Studies and Analyses. And in the US, for that matter, it's the University of Virginia at the moment. So we have a couple of core partners that we really rely on, where we also want to expand our local presence. So at the moment, we're thinking about setting up local offices in a number of countries, including China, South Africa, Brazil, and I think Dubai it is.
Okay, thank you very much. Can I ask one question? You mentioned at the end, you try to develop the Korea Center to the Asia Center. So you try to now destroy Korea Center and set up the new institute. Is there any reason because of the conflict between Korea and Japan? Just give me the quick answer.
No intention
Don't
to
destroy
don't destroy the Korea Center, of course. But I think, of course, a concrete relation between Japan and Korea is important, of course. However, to consider about the real relationship between the two countries, relative point of view is very important. So, from next month, Japanese school season will be start. Busan and Fukuoka's connection, the educational training system is expand, including the Hawaii University. So I said it is important to process the English educational program, of course, but including the Hawaii University participate in the program, our complete relation become the relative relation. So that's important. So I never destroyed the Korean Center, of course. But yeah. I want to say the more many point of view to investigate the relation between my country and your country. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
I know you said continuously. You said you are not a director, so we'll see what your director will do. Okay, now we'll open the floor, and I'm just now I've become older and older. I cannot really recognize your name. So if you want to speak, I mean, perhaps the best way is you can just and we'll see how many people would like to say. Okay, we'll start from this side, and then we'll turn around to 3 people. Okay, please.
I am Jong-Wha from Kölner University. I have a simple question to Professor Whitaker or Sleeping Princess. How come the average age of Asians 24, 22, just like that? The longevity or life expectancy is so short. I don't understand.
Okay, the average age for Asians in New Zealand is 31, and for Maori and Pacifica, it's in the 20s. Asian migration is a relatively recent phenomenon, so it tends to be a younger population that's moved, so that's no surprise. Maori and Pacifica families they have average family sizes bigger. There's also migration from Pacific Islands to New Zealand, so they also tend to be young. So it's kind of young populations, whereas the white European population is long established and aging and having fewer and fewer children.
Okay, next.
I think one of the missions of this session is to encourage or promote the kind of dialogue within and outside of Asia to contribute to create new type of studies of Asian studies. Of course, it's quite tricky to make a clear line between Asia and non-Asia, because I have done research on the definition of Asia by asking a question to the students in Asia. So the definition of Asia might be different from country to country. So it's quite difficult, let's say New Zealand will belong to Asia or not, because some proportion of Asian students regard New Zealand is a part of Asia. But anyway, I have one question to the delegates from New Zealand and Germany. What do you think the comparative advantage of studying Asia in your country? This is a simple, but probably quite difficult question for you to answer. And one question to the delegate from Malaysia. Well, it seems to me that the Institute is also a kind of regional distinction between East Asia, Southeast Asia, Japan, Korea. But let's say if you are interested, if some researchers are interested in Sino-Korean relations, then where, let's say, these researchers should go. If you are interested in, let's say, inter-relational or international or inter-ethnic relations, if the students are interested in, then which department, which center they should go.
So, Germany and New Zealand, why do you study Asian studies? No, I understand. So what was the comparative advantage in studying Asian studies in your country? Just the question.
Right. I think there are a couple of answers to it, and I'll just give you one at the moment. That is, the advantage of studying Asia and Europe is that Europe is far away, and that gives you an advantage of being sort of not embroiled in sort of any sort of political disputes or tensions that might exist within in the region. So you can actually speak your mind, right? Rather than be sort of careful about sort of what might be either the composition of a certain government in a certain country at the moment, or what might be sort of partisan lines. Which do affect, let's face it, which do affect academic communities in many countries here in the region. Let's say when we comment as an institute on, let's say, island disputes, territorial disputes, we can be, or at least try to be, some sort of detached observer that, try to give sort of, the various viewpoints that exist. And that is best done when we actually have specialists who are able to give sort of viewpoints. And this goes back to what I said before. I would like to have, let's say, for example, at the moment we have something like 10 people working on China at the Institute for Asian Studies, but we only have one person working on Japan for various reasons. And there's sort of, there needs to be some sort of rebalancing to be able to give this kind of detached, hopefully neutral sort of analysis and viewpoints. But of course, the idea is that you have to engage with as many possible partners as possible in the region. You can't just do it on your own. I think that idea is totally passé to work just on Asia. You have to sort of cooperate with as many partners and diverse partners as possible in the region.
Okay, good question. I moved back to New Zealand about 7 or 8 years ago, and in the first couple of years after I moved back, we had some visitors from South America, from universities in Chile and Brazil and Argentina, and they would ask to come and visit the Asia Center. And as we had a discussion, I asked them, why are you interested in talking with someone from the Asia Center? And they said, well, because they have Japanese, Korean populations of their own who have migrated there, and they can have their own direct relations. Why come all the way to New Zealand? And they said, well, we kind of see you as a bridge. You have European culture, but you're also quite close to Asia. So we would like to collaborate with you in relating to Asia. Now, that struck me at the time as being very odd. I couldn't really get my head around that. To be honest, I don't know, we can say, yes, we have a European culture and we have Asian cultures and so on. I don't think that's a real comparative advantage. I don't know if we do have any comparative advantages. Certainly, though, for transmigration and diaspora studies and kind of multicultural cities and that kind of thing, we're a good laboratory. But I'm not sure that there's any real comparative advantage from the location of the country vis-a-vis Asia itself. We are kind of on the fringe. If you take ASEAN plus 6, we kind of squeeze in there along with Australia. If Australia weren't next to us, we would probably be off the map, but Australia is included, so people include New Zealand. ASEAN plus 3, of course, we're not in that picture, so we're kind of on the fringes. I don't think there is a compelling comparative advantage from our location per se.
Anything about this geographical classification between, say, East Asia and Southeast Asia?
I will respond to the second question.
Okay, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I agree with you. We have a lot of programs as well as research center in University of Malaya talking about Asian studies. And for your information, we are in the process of rationalization, restructuring our programs, as well as research institute and research center in University of Malaya. Currently, we have, I think, if I'm not mistaken, maybe 14 faculties, academies, and institute. So the previous vice chancellor has proposed to have only 5 colleges. So under these colleges, there will be a faculty and school, as well as programs. So another point is, I mentioned about Chinese Studies Department, China Studies Program. we also have Chinese language in the Faculty of Languages and Linguistics. We also have Kongsi Institute, I mentioned just now. So at least for China, we have 4. Yeah? Chinese Studies Department, China Studies Program in the Department of East Asian Studies, Chinese Studies, Chinese Language in the Faculty of Languages and Linguistics, as well as Institute of Kongsi. Yeah? So we have 4. So that's why we are in the process of restructuring our program. I think because of overlapping. Yeah? And for the Korea Studies program, we have Korea Studies in the Department of East Asian Studies, and recently in 2012 we established Malaysia-Korea Research Center. Why Malaysia-Korea Research Center? I think since 2008 we got a status by the government as a RU, Research University. We have altogether 20 public universities. So 5 are research. So if we establish a research center and we publish in ISI Index Journal, we have a postdoc, and then we increase number of PhD students. Government will pump in money to all these research centers. So that's why we established Malaysia-Korea Research Center and Malaysia-Japan Research Center in 2012. Yeah. Okay, thank you.
We have currently 2 more people in the list, and Philip Aiken, and then President Dwara, and then we'll vote. So, okay. We have plenty of time.
Okay, I was just making a connection with what we discussed this morning in terms of academic activism. And first, I like the concept of Kyushu and Busan University working together. I think it's a great way for scholars to take a stake in this often discourse led by state politicians, basically. But I want, especially I was interested in your presentation, Professor Park, because you're creating this department or this institute on Burmese studies, on Myanmar studies.
Yeah.
I'm interested in how you are, if you could tell us more about how you conceive this program. Is it going to be, because you make reference to project that could help economic cooperation between Korea, Korean companies and Myanmar. Of course, Myanmar now is opening up, so everybody wants to go to Myanmar. But I'm a bit skeptical when I see that it is always the wealthy countries who jump on this new craze in Southeast Asia, including for knowledge production, with very little space for counterparts, Myanmar counterparts, to be part of this intellectual dialogue. And that's, by the way, what we try to do with Africa and Asia, by the way. But I wanted to ask you what you include in terms of capacity building in the case of Myanmar to ensure that you will have a real dialogue and it won't be just because Myanmar is opening up for Korean companies.
Yes, thank you.
I wonder if I can ride on that question because it's related.
And you can answer 2 questions.
I enjoyed your presentation very much, Professor Park. I think it brings up this larger issue that I had noted earlier, which has to do with how particularly Korean companies have taken the lead in Asia, in Southeast Asia and South Asia, in a way that sort of has left behind every other sector, and particularly, if I may say so, the academic sector. And I think it's very important and interesting that you have started this network now, probably 20 years the center. But I think it's very important also to network, to be able to press them. Because if they're there, they're making so much money there, it's so important for them there in these Asian societies. I think so what you have done is in fact taking little bits of things and providing services for them. I think it's much more important to be able to network with all the other entities here, Busan, and perhaps transnational agencies, scholarly agencies as well, including the ones that I'm talking about, to have them respond a little more, to have them be a little more responsible for the scholarly activity and, as he says, empowering groups there. So I just want to leave it. It seems to me that it's should be part of the agenda of this new effort.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I started my education career from the Indian studies. I completed my master's degrees in Indian studies, so I learned Sanskrit and Hindi. And then I went to Japan to study Burmese language from National Scholarship for Burmese Studies. So I have actually experienced a lot, so from various areas and then various kinds of disciplines, thanks to the Kyoto University. So I have learned even agriculture also. So I guess the real area the expert for area studies. So the single scholar has to learn a lot of disciplines, and then it's a very kinds of languages also. So actually, to study Southeast Asian studies, so for example, historian. So he should have a knowledge of Sanskrit, Chinese, even French or local language of Southeast Asia. It requires a very harsh knowledge from the beginning. So, but as in my case, so I have spent a lot of times and money for Myanmar studies. So I I visited for the first time in Myanmar in 1989 at 1988 movements, democratic movements. At 1 year I went to. So actually, I studied the Aung San Suu Kyi together in Japan for 1 year. So, but actually at the time, nobody to have friends in Myanmar, and so I have tried some harsh in Myanmar. So I got so many people familiar. So it depends on my own trial and experience. So I got a lot of data and information. So now I have established my private network in Myanmar. So from government ministers to the ordinary company staff. So I have established a great network in Myanmar. So if I need right now, I need some information, so I can send an email or kato or call. So I can make information to me directly within 1 day. So this is my private trial for Myanmar studies. So I have a connection with a lot of companies. So now I am providing a very useful research results from our website, making map to Cambodia and also other companies to send them. So translated some laws or various kinds of laws into translating to Koreans. And so in response with the companies providing some fund or like that, some I can say in details, but anyhow, so this is my great energy to maintain our institute. So as a local area in Busan area, not so in Busan local private school, so it's very difficult for us to maintain a research institute. So because of short of fund, money and support, not from so much support from school, you know. So, but we had to. So I tried to connect such kind of a network, all kinds of throughout my institute to researchers or students. So this is our institute's power. So as I told you, we are small but very hot institute. Yeah. Okay. Okay.
I found Professor Sonoda's question quite interesting and crucial about the location of a study of Asia, you know, within or outside Asia. Of course, it's hard to define what is Asia. But apparently, it's US, Europe, and Australia, New Zealand, maybe outside Asia. So, but sometimes New Zealand and Australia are becoming a part of Asia as well. So, I think Australia and New Zealand experience now is quite interesting. As David said, the Asia within New Zealand and Australia is becoming more prominent. But at the same time, Asia, New Zealand and Australia are in Asia, geographically speaking. And so it's in, but always in, but not all Asia kind of mentality still exists. So I think New Zealand and Australia case shows a kind of difficult question of being how to overcome the here and there distinction. And also very interesting case. So that's what I'm engaged with in Australian context. But at the same time, so your question is the advantage of studying Asia outside Asia. And also the German case, you as suggested, is more detached, more objective, without being involved in any political or national interest matters. I think I agree. The same happened in Australia and New Zealand as well. But I think it's more, for me, it's an advantage of being not detached but more engaged with some issue like a territorial issue now in Japan, Korea, China, because we are kind of free, but it's not free. Another kind of national interest with us, German national interest, Australian, New Zealand national interest, and relationship to China or Japan, Korea, whatever. But I think rather than thinking about the advantage, disadvantage, how the institution within Asia or researcher within Asia and outside Asia, how they can collaborate or work together to engage with emerging issues. Because so this morning, Professor Khan's paper I read, so you also seem to be suggesting more dialogue among Asian researchers within Asia. So that's what I take from your writing. I agree to some extent. So this is one important development, and we should advance further. But at the same time, so in this sense, again, researchers or institutions outside Asia, how they can be involved in a meaningful and more engaging manner, working together with research institution within Asia. So this is a kind of beauty. Of course, Euro-American so area studies has been quite politically developed, particularly after 1945, and also much to do with the colonial history. But now, if we go beyond this kind of relationship, how many institutional researchers be within Asia or outside Asia can more meaningfully cooperate or collaborate with each other. So that's kind of things I think we should discuss more in this kind of conference. Yeah, thank you.
I'm writing on this comment. Okay. Yeah. This issue, how Asia studies differences between Asia studies within Asia and outside Asia. This question is not just about how to locate Asia, but also how to identify yourself with Asia or your research subject. There's significant differences between the ways in which Asia studies is conducted within and outside Asia, and that's, in my opinion, heavily related to the question on whether you consider your work as something studying the others or yourself. You know, for instance, even in Korea, Asian studies, where Korea is considered as within Asia, but the ways in which Asian studies conducted, there's some significant differences between those who are studying Southeast Asia and Northeast Asia. Those who study Southeast Asia, their research subject is something about others, right? But Northeast Asia, they're studying something about themselves. So the way, because of that, you know, I think there's significant differences in terms of your research method and approaches. That's mainly depending on how you relate yourself with your research subject. So, having said that, maybe I have a question to Professor Whitaker, because New Zealand case is very interesting. It used to be considered as not part of Asia, but as you mentioned, New Zealand is getting more and more like Asia, part of Asia, right? So, which means that the people in New Zealand are getting more and more identifying themselves with Asia than in previous years. So, has this kind of change given an impact on the ways in which Asian studies have been conducted in New Zealand? Maybe that might give us some interesting, you know, clues to figure out this question. And I have a second question to Professor Park. The map center idea is really interesting because I'm a geographer. So as a geographer, I'm very interested in map and map making. And also, I know it's very difficult to create maps and gather maps. And geographical information is really difficult to deal with. So my question is, how did you get the maps, you know, in the website, or did you create the maps by yourself, or you got those maps from some institutions, something like that kind of questions? I'm very curious.
Yes, I think I take back some of what I said before, having reflected on it a bit more carefully. Behind those figures of the rapid rise of the Asian population of Auckland, of course, is the fact that many families have relocated for the sake of the education of their children, and the fact that our education system is in English, and so it has been a small English-speaking, relatively safe, relatively cheap kind of country, has attracted a lot of people. So there is a kind of a locational attraction for people from Asia. It's kind of close to Asia, but it's English-speaking. And that's also, I suppose, if you turn it around, the smallness of the country and New Zealand's diplomatic activities, relatively peaceful image, and so on, has led to a kind of a role for New Zealand in the Asian debate. And I saw on your slides the New Zealand Asia Institute. We've collaborated with the University of Malaya and a lot of other universities for many years in a kind of a way that Seoul National University's Asia Center is doing now. We've done on a smaller basis, often remotely organizing conferences around Asia. So there is a kind of a role for a small English-speaking country on the fringes. Now, your question is, has that kind of otherness which enabled us to carry out that role, has that otherness changed as New Zealand has become more Asian? I suppose there are several types of person in New Zealand. There are those who live outside Auckland for whom Asia is still an other and possibly somewhat threatening because lots of people are moving in and house prices are going up and wages are not going up, so it's becoming more difficult for people to buy houses and things. But increasingly my colleagues are Asian. When we go out and eat together, we eat at Asian restaurants. They go back to their home countries, to universities. I mean, often they're not even their home countries. I have colleagues who are third generation Chinese, for instance, who have distant relatives living in China, and so it's becoming very mixed. So for different types of persons in New Zealand, that question means something quite different. So for some, it's a dialogue with the other. For others, it's a dialogue with something that's kind of myself. And a very interesting phenomenon we have is a student-led conference. We call it Asia Savvy. And who takes part in that? There are a lot of kids who are, not kids, well, sorry, students who have a variety of backgrounds, often Asian parents or an Asian parent or a passionate interest in Asia, and they're constructing a kind of a dialogue amongst themselves, and that's really wonderful to see. And that's, for them, Asia is not other, Asia is right there in their dialogue.
Actually, that will be our business secret. But basically, we are not using the GIS, so it takes a lot of money, costs, and then require professional work. So, but basically, we are using Google Map, satellite, or UN cartography as publicly open copyright. We are using that map, but actually, we draw from the Adobe Illustrator using vector program, and we can add as a result of our research work, and then we can add a new street and then a new temple or like that. So we are recompose and then for the public purpose. Yeah. Thank you.
I think this session we had a very interesting discussion. The title of this session is the Asian Studies Within and Outside Asia. So it's naturally related to the identity of Asia. Well, I used to be the chief economist at the Asian Development Bank. So let me just say that legally and officially, New Zealand and Australia belong to Asia. Geographically, it belongs to Oceania, everyone knows. But that's the regional member. And then people's perception is usually if you ask questions, it's a serious joke. If the country coming to the Asian Cups or Asian Games, that's basically member of the Asia. So US does not belong to the Asia. But there is questions of what countries in the Middle East belongs to the Asia. That's always very complicated. Clearly, the issue is I think the location is not that important. That's my perception and my argument. Because pretty much this Asian studies is driven by the interest. I would not say just the economic interest, economic, political, and social and human interest. And then maybe that demand would be much higher in the countries outside Asia than countries within Asia. So I think we cannot really say that because the country belongs to the Asia, the country has the stronger or bigger demand for studying or doing research on Asia. So in that leads to my conclusion is this idea of connecting the Asian studies centers together to promote the interesting research on certain important topics. I think that makes sense. That would be good. Or I think that collaboration may not just combine people and people, maybe some funding with some serious researchers in several centers together. So that kind of format, I think, is this SNU, Asia Center, work on that. But one issue I would raise is that many countries, even in Korea, I think it's this kind of studies, especially in the area driven by the national interest. So sometimes it would be very difficult. You can justify the role of Korea in promoting the Asian studies at the international context. So I'm not saying that very negatively. Basically, this will be the big challenge, but I would like to really commend the SNU Asia Center to initiate this kind of long-term project. In that remark, I would like to conclude this session. Please give a big hands to all the speakers and the broad participants.